description. I actually was the subject of a sharper description a few months ago when we have hundreds of new Labour MPs in the House, far too many for me to remember their names. So whenever I bump into a new one, I stick out my hand and say, "My name's David Davis." Give them a chance to introduce themselves normally. Only on one occasion, I stuck out my hand and said, "My name's David Davis," and the chap said, "I know who you are. You're the Member of Parliament who's never knowingly on message." Which rather put me in my place, I have to say. But it's appropriate today because what I'm going to talk about, democracy in Scotland, is not as yet my party's policy. It should be. I think it will be in due course, but just so you know, this is not the Conservative Party line, this is my line. It's also a privilege and a pleasure to be here. Partly, of course, because I'm speaking today, as Taz intimated really, in commemoration of my dear friend Alex Salmond. In truth, I'm going to talk about something which we both agreed on, and indeed, before he died, we agreed I'd make this speech. So I'm here under instruction from Alex Salmond. And while I'm at it, Mr. President, may I give you my personal thank you for the way you gave him some dignity at his demise when the rest of us failed to get our governments to behave properly. So thank you. It's something I'll never forget. Now, you may find it surprising that Alec and I agreed on how Scotland should be governed, the best way to govern Scotland, and because, he was the leading exponent of Scottish independence in modern times, and I'm an old-fashioned, dyed-in-the-wool, English, conservative, UK unionist. So, where is the overlap? Well, I'll explain that in a minute. But, if you look at it as the Bruce and Longshank in agreement, it might put you in context. Yeah? At least we didn't come to blows. But we both believed Scotland deserved the best possible government, and we weren't actually getting it. So in a moment, I'm going to describe how we both thought we could improve it. But I also want to say I'm pleased to be here because I'm pleased to be in Edinburgh. I have long taken the view that Scotland, this is one of the places where many of the founding principles of modern civilization were created. A number of people have said today, from President Ivanov last night to Mark speaking earlier, that they've told us how important Scotland's great intellectuals have been in the history of the world. And Scotland's intellectuals didn't just shape their own time. They reshaped the way Britain, Europe, North America, most of the other democratic societies thought about society, liberty, and government. In a sentence, the Scottish Enlightenment created the intellectual toolkit of modern thought, from political economy and empirical philosophy to the new human sciences, as the President said last night. And Scottish thinkers linked medicine, science, law, history, moral philosophy in a practical, reform-minded spirit that diffused widely across the entire modern world, really. So that's what the modern world owes Scotland. And I just want to put that on record, as it were, before I talk about Scotland itself. Because today, democracy is struggling. And it's not just true of Scotland. All modern democracies are struggling, again, as the President intimated, in their attempts to deal with a new class of intractable problems. Across everything, from healthcare to warfare, from diplomacy to cultural standards. And because most modern democracies and most conventional centrist parties are failing in the eyes of the public, we're seeing the rise of populist and often extremist parties across the world. So what I say today, in some ways, is true of all the countries within the United Kingdom and far beyond it too. But today I'm going to speak specifically about Scotland, partly because Alec and I agreed it, but because I think there are acute issues facing this nation which have potential solutions that can be agreed on by all political parties. And indeed, they should be agreed on by all political parties. And when I talk about the problems that Scotland faces, I should make it plain that I speak as an admirer of this nation. As many have already said, Scottish genius is important in the Scottish Enlightenment. But more than that, in many respects, the Scottish nation has helped build the United Kingdom and the most important and greatest aspects of it. So, we and the rest of the world owe it a great debt. And in that light, the reason I'm a unionist, actually, is that the union was not one, in my view, of territorial gain. It was a union of ideas and intellect, and that's really important to remember. Now, it's a little over 25 years since the Scottish Parliament first met in May 1999. And the nation was united behind that Parliament. 3/4 of Scots voted in favour of devolution. So after all of that, many of us had really high hopes about the potential for Scotland and the Scottish government's success in running its affairs. What I say now is not political or even personal in that context, because I remember Donald Dewar's speech, Donald Dewar, one of the great architects of devolution, when he said, "This is about more than our politics and our laws. This is about who we are and how we carry ourselves." He was right, but may I respectfully say, the Scottish Parliament has not carried itself with the pride and sense that this nation deserves. But I believe we can correct that, in many ways, by going back to what Dewar himself believed. The people who care about Scotland care less about constitutional matters and more about how it carries itself. They care about whether the hospital looks after their ageing parents properly, or whether they deliver their children safely. They care about whether schools give the best educational outcome and the best career chances for the youngsters. They care about whether the taxpayers' money is spent wisely. Now, by those measures, given Scotland's talented population, the government of Scotland should be a resounding success. But I'm afraid that has not been the case. Now, when I was a young man, Scotland was one of the leading meritocracies in the world. One of its greatest exports were talented young men and women. The young financiers, the young engineers, the young doctors, the young journalists. British journalism had been dominated by Scots editors and Scots journalists, for example, in politics alone. But since then, it's not become a great model of social meritocracy. Indeed, it's falling down the international education league tables. And even Nicola Sturgeon's recent autobiography, not marked by its modesty, reveals that she failed miserably at closing the education gap. She herself accepts that. Similarly, when I was a young man, Scotland was home to some of the best hospitals and doctors in the world. It was almost a part of the British stereotype, the Scottish doctor. Yeah? Today, the performance of the Scottish Health Service is declining even when compared with the English Health Service, which is doing badly in its own right. In 2015-2016, funding was cut for alcohol and drug services, and now Scotland has the highest drug death rate pretty much in the world, certainly in Europe and America, even though it's slightly improved in the last year. And as for managing Scotland's taxpayers' money, the Scottish Government's record is unbelievably bad. Whether it's the £600 million wasted on the Fergus Marine Ferry fiasco, the nearly £1 billion spent on the Barrel prison in Glasgow, the deposit return scheme collapse, the BIFAD bailout, or the never-ending expensive public inquiries. One way or another, the Scottish Government appears to have wasted £6.7 billion. Alex always used to lecture me, don't talk in billions, talk about what it means to the ordinary person. That means at least £2,300 paid for by every income taxpayer in Scotland. £2,300 a person in waste alone. Now, they might all be seen as failures of government management at one level, failures to run the national enterprise properly. But government, of course, is about more than just management. Government's about changing society. And fundamental to that is legislation, creating new laws to reshape the future. In that respect, the Scottish Government has had a more spectacular set of failures than most. 3 hugely controversial pieces of legislation stand out. The Gender Reform Bill, supposed to reform gender recognition laws. The Named Persons Bill, designed to provide a protective person for every child. And the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act. All of these have failed, and either were struck down by the courts or repealed. Critically, the governments failed a fundamental test of leadership in that they did not take the population with them in building a new vision of the future for Scotland. Now, if the Westminster Village, where I work, is often out of step with the rest of the UK, you could say that at times, crucial times, the Holyrood hamlet does not represent what Scots really care about. If Holyrood had been a fully effective parliament, then some of these failures could have been prevented, and all of them could have been corrected more quickly. Now, worse even than this, in my view, were the ethical failures of the Scottish Government. There are a number, but the starkest was the treatment of Alex Salmond. Now, I won't dwell in detail on these. I've spent thousands of words, as Taz referred, in the Westminster Parliament on this subject. But let me simply say this. It's a failure that, like other failures, reflects on the constitutional structure that we gave to the Scottish Parliament back in 1999. A mistake which, I have to say, some Scots saw at the time, most particularly Donald Dewar. And that government, as I say, failed in its ethical handling of the Alex Salmond case. It put in place procedures that were described by Scotland's highest civil court as tainted by apparent bias. And because of that bias, those procedures were struck down by judicial review. Now, in many countries of the world, what happened to Alex Salmond might have been unsurprising. It's not necessarily unusual for a government to distort the legal system to bring oppressive charges against a previous political leader. But I have to say, I never imagined it would happen in any of the countries of the United Kingdom. Certainly not Scotland, with its public commitment to justice, the public belief to justice in this country. Now, of course, the fundamentals of the justice system did in fact rescue the issue. A majority female jury and a fair-minded female judge exonerated Alex. And I expect that his estate will now succeed in its claim against the government. A government, by the way, that uses delays, obstruction, deceit, the improper spending of large quantities of taxpayers' money in a deliberate attempt to exhaust his family's resources. Again, the classic behaviour of an unchallenged, overmighty state. Now, what Donald Dewar wanted was for Holyrood to be a modern parliament, of course, but equally important, he wanted it to be a powerful parliament. The reason many parliaments and democracies in the world look to Westminster as a model is because it was a successful parliament. Over 2 centuries, it generally delivered reasonable government for the United Kingdom. But the reason it was a successful parliament, and Donald Dewar understood this very well, was that it was a very powerful parliament. And note, I say a powerful parliament, not a powerful government, a powerful parliament. It's a very important distinction. The powers vested in an individual member of Parliament in Westminster amount to almost unfettered freedom of speech because of the rules of privilege, parliamentary privilege. This matters Because the single most powerful driver of democracy is fearless freedom of speech. So if, as a British Member of Parliament, I want to challenge a powerful entity, be that a government or a state or a court which I think is guilty of a miscarriage of justice, or a wealthy oligarch who's abusing his powers in Britain to crush his opposition, or any other entity that's far more powerful than I am or could wish to be, I will use my rights in Westminster. So, for example, I'll pick an example that happened in Scotland back in the 90s when the British government wrongly accused of gross misconduct two pilots who flew a Chinook helicopter into the Mulligan Tyre. Many of you may remember that. And they accused them and convicted them of gross misconduct, which is effectively convicting them of manslaughter. Well, I raised the matter in the House of Commons. I challenged them in the House of Commons and exposed the government's behaviour as improper, even arguably corrupt, despite the fact they tried to claim they had military reasons for their misbehaviour. And after 10 years of this, they were exonerated. They were proven to be innocent. When Russian oligarchs were abusing the British legal system to crush their opponents, I was able to deal with them in the House of Commons without them being able to use the very same legal system against me. And when one oligarch did try, he failed miserably. When other potential miscarriages of justice needed their cases exposed, whether it was the postmasters and postmistresses who were oppressed by the state due to a faulty computer system, whether it was financial traders who were sent to prison as scapegoats for the financial crash, which was actually caused by the regulators and politicians, whether it was journalists denied free speech, or indeed whether it was Alex Salmond, I and others could use the House of Commons to highlight their cases without fear of some government or powerful individual or agency crushing us, taking action against us. Now, contrast that with the treatment of the Scottish Parliamentary Committee that investigated the Scottish Government's handling of the complaints about the Alex Salmond affair. On several occasions, the committee was told untruths by civil servants, untruths that then had to be corrected later. On other occasions, civil servants simply refused to answer questions on certain issues. The First Minister was unable to remember, she said, on dozens of occasions, important bits of evidence. And on one occasion, most critically, the Lord Advocate threatened the committee with prosecution if they published some of the evidence that they had been provided, even though that evidence had already been published in the Spectator newspaper. Now, had anything like that been tried against a Westminster Select Committee, the equivalent of a parliamentary committee, the individuals concerned would have been arraigned before the House of Commons, and the Select Committee themselves would simply have brushed aside and rejected as ridiculous attempts to confine what they could hear, what they could know, what they could say. And this shows in a crystalline way how important the absolute freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry is to Parliament, for Parliament to hold government to account. This, in my view, is why Donald Dewar, the architect of the Scottish Parliament, considered this to be an important right to give to Holyrood. That's the right of absolute parliamentary privilege. So you could be neither sued nor prosecuted for anything you said in Holyrood as in Westminster. It's also, by the way, why governments and executives almost never volunteer such powers. Being held to account is almost invariably uncomfortable. It's frequently politically costly, personally embarrassing, and that's why governments sometimes have to be forced into it, why parliaments have to seize the powers themselves. The most famous example is John Wilkes in Westminster in the late 1700s. I think he had 3. I had 1 by-election. He had 3, I think, to force the government to do what it needed to do. So I repeat, unfettered free speech is the most powerful, effective motor of democracy. the curbing of free speech, the curbing of free information, the curbing of free access are all contributors to the poor state of Western democracy, and in particular to the poor state of Scottish democracy. Now, with that free speech, of course, comes a number of conditions. First of these is the duty of candour on the part of the government and government agencies. Now, this should not be controversial. Indeed, the Labour Party, I compliment them, the Labour Party put it as a part of their manifesto, that duty of candour. And the Labour government hasn't actually done anything about it yet, and at least not in as much as it affects itself. So we need to look to see what will happen there. But the duty of candour, in my view, should be imposed on the Scottish government in dealing with the Scottish Parliament. And it should be enforceable in law. It should be matched by a range of other powers that should accrue to ordinary members of Holyrood, and in particular, members of opposition parties in Holyrood. Back in the 19th century, Gladstone created the Public Accounts Committee, one of his great constitutional reforms. And when he did so, he made it a rule that the chairmanship of the Public Accounts Committee should always go to a member of the opposition, not to a member of government. And this was a huge, and still is, a hugely powerful committee. In 1997 through 2001, I was the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, and one of the things I did in the creation of Holyrood was to try and make that rule apply here, and it did, but it hasn't quite had the effect yet that it should have, but it did. So we should do that, however, for all the major committees. Ensure that the opposition has command, as it were, of the major committees, again, to hold government to account. It also means enhancing the powers, the remuneration, the resourcing of the parliamentary committees, so that they're able to do their job to the full, which they're not at the moment. And in addition, I almost was tempted to say this last night at your meeting with the presiding officer, we should enhance and reinforce the role of the presiding officer, Holyrood's speaker. We should give her a whole series of what might sound like rather minor or procedural powers, actually would have a very big impact by allowing her to make the speeches that people give much longer, take them away from where they are now, which is basically a string of tweets and sound bites, give the free choice of subjects to debate to her and Holyrood itself, and away from the government, so that they can actually dictate the issue of the day. And the debates themselves, ideally, at least in some circumstances, should be binding. Or at least give them more weight than they currently are. Typically, they're shrugged off. I'll come back to that in a second. The virtue of this, I'm going to give you a sort of slightly controversial example. The virtue of this has been demonstrated in Westminster. Back in my life, the starkest one was back in 2011, the European Court of Human Rights instructed the British government to give prisoner votes, to give prisoners the vote. Now, I'm a human rights activist, and I didn't agree with that, and neither did about 85% of the British public. Nevertheless, David Cameron, the Prime Minister, said he'd give in to that and do it, and the rest of Parliament didn't like that idea. So I put a motion before the House. We won it with a majority of over 200. I was supported by Jack Straw, who's the man who put the Human Rights Act through the House of Commons, and the government did as it was told, did as we told it. And the European Court of Human Rights took the point and backed off. So if Westminster Parliament can have that much clout and that much power, so should the Holyrood Parliament. Now, it's altogether too easy for the governments in London, as well as in Holyrood, to timetable critical debates at times that deny them coverage and therefore influence. That subtle power alone can cripple the effectiveness of Holyrood. Now, all of this was made plain in the debates over Alex Salmond and the Parliamentary Committee's unsuccessful attempts to resolve those matters. And in fact, what they did, that committee did in fact, rather courageously for Holyrood, criticise the First Minister and said she had misled Holyrood. But what happened as a result of that? Well, I have to tell you, if a select committee in Westminster had said that the Prime Minister had misled Parliament, I promise you you can be pretty sure there would be some sizable, almost seismic repercussions. What happened here? Nothing. Yeah, it just went by the day. That issue also highlights one other problem, which is the lack of separation of powers in Scotland between the administration, the executive, and the judiciary. Under circumstances like the investigation of a politically charged case like the prosecution of Alex Salmond, it should not be even imaginable, let alone possible, that the head of public prosecution process should be a serving member of the cabinet, as they are in Scotland, in the form of the Lord Advocate. Lord Advocate here does two jobs, what would be two jobs in the rest of the United Kingdom. They are the Attorney General, and they provide legal advice to the Cabinet and to the government, and so they are in fact a member of the Cabinet, or at least they attend Cabinet. And the other job that the Lord Advocate does is effectively the same as the Director of Public Prosecutions. They head the prosecution service and therefore make decisions about who is prosecuted and for what. They have to be separated if you are going to have a respectable process. Now, this is a really, really serious issue in substantive terms, but it's also serious in that the public at large is losing their faith in the even-handedness of the justice system, in their own ability to rely on being treated fairly and receiving impartial justice. Now, that's not just true in Scotland. I have to admit, in the rest of the United Kingdom, the accusation of two-tier justice is just about the most toxic accusation you can make, and it's happening even when we do have separation of powers. But independence of the operation of the law from government is the first and necessary step to putting that right, and it's long overdue here. And the final aspect of enhancing Holyrood's powers relates to the enforcement of accountability. Governments throughout the United Kingdom, and in Scotland in particular, have been generally pretty cavalier about meeting their responsibilities for providing information and responding to Parliament. Again, this was at its starkest in the Alex Salmond case, and still is, where the current Scottish Government keeps refusing to provide or unredact documentation which is critical to the understanding of the Hamilton report on that case. Hamilton himself has described the redacted version of his report as misleading, and yet the Scottish Parliament, having been instructed by the court and instructed by the Information Commissioner, still has not provided the information to the public. Now, it seems to me there should be a mechanism in Scotland where a combination of the Information Commissioner and Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament, should be able to compel government to release the appropriate documentation legally and have the powers of summary dismissal of any public servant who refuses to comply irrespective of the instruction of ministers. That's really important, that the public service, the civil servants, should be responsible for delivering on what Parliament Information Commissioner insists on. And it's quite apparent that in both the current and recent Scottish governments that ministers appear to think that civil servants have a duty to them and not to Parliament. That's wrong, it's ignorant, it's self-serving, it's constitutionally improper, and it reinforces a tendency of the Scottish establishment, just like every political establishment in the world, to look after their own at the expense of the public. So, Parliament, by which I mean members, individual members of Parliament, and individual opposition parties, should have the right to initiate binding debates. They should have the right to initiate not just parliamentary inquiries, but also public and judicial inquiries, where appropriate. And crucially, they must have the resources available to them, resources that the government should not be able to suppress or withhold. That happens in Westminster too, that the government tries to withhold resources. What we should be looking at in this era of populist revolt around the Western world is to make Holyrood a beacon of democracy. I'm quite sure that's what was intended in 1999, that Holyrood should be set up as an exemplar of democracy for the rest of the United Kingdom. But in the last 25 years, the powers of the Scottish Government have been hugely enhanced. The powers of the Scottish Parliament, of individual MSPs, should be similarly enhanced to hold that government to account. Indeed, given the habit of modern governments of all parties in Westminster to go to the opposite direction of trying to inhibit and handicap Parliament's ability to control government, and they all do it, and I've been in governments which have done it too, I would like to see a circumstance in which Holyrood is seen as a better exemplar of democratic practice than Westminster is. That should be the model. Scotland should be looking to be better than Westminster, not simply similar to it. Now, I can say these things with a high degree of certainty. I served in government and in cabinet for over a decade. I served as the chairman of the most powerful select committee in Parliament, and for a long time I've operated as a backbencher, battling on the behalf of various people against governments, including the Scottish government. And so I know how difficult, how awkward this is, how painful it can be for ministers, how difficult it makes their job. But the hard truth is very simple. More democracy is always better than less democracy. Always. Uncomfortable, difficult, but better. What governments will discover, to their surprise, I think, is that the more powerful their democracy is, the more they have to explain themselves to a powerful parliament, the more they have to respond to the real interests of their constituents, the more robust and the more powerful they will be in seeing off the populists. I mean, I'm not going to go into the names of the individuals, but can you imagine some of those individual populist leaders standing and trying to face a parliament with a complex issue, complex healthcare issue, might I say complex immigration issue? They would have some trouble. And so strong democracies are not just better governments, they're more stable governments, and for the politicians in the longer run, they're better for them too. So, as I say, the answer to those populist challenges is more democracy, not less. A bolder constitutional experiment, not a more timorous one. More John Wilkes, less Sir Humphrey Appleby. Or if Alex Salmon was standing here today, I'm quite sure he'd say, more bold Braveheart, less hesitant Hamlet. So that's my task, and it's what I'm going to call on all the parties to do, is to make Holyrood a shining beacon of democracy, so that Edinburgh again will, as it once did before, give intellectual leadership to the whole world. Thank you.